She said it in fury, not despair. The laughter of the other ladies had grated against her nerves all afternoon, sharp, pitying, edged with triumph. Thalia Ravenshaw lifted her chin, dark eyes flashing. "Then let fate decide," she declared, her voice ringing across the sunlit lawn. "The first man through that door I'll marry, right here, right now." The women tittered, certain it was only her famous sharp tongue at work. No one took her seriously. Not really. Then the ornate wrought-iron gates creaked open. The laughter died slowly, strangled by a sudden collective gasp. A tall figure in severe black stepped through, petals of pale pink drifting around him like silent witnesses. He did not smile. He did not pause. He looked directly at her. His Grace, the Duke of Northmere, had arrived. Oh, my dears, before we step deeper into this delicious drama, my youngest daughter has issued a solemn threat. If this channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, she will finally stop hiding my reading glasses. So if you're enjoying this tale of tempers and dukes, tap that subscribe button and leave a little heart or a listening from Nigeria or from London in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. It truly makes my heart glad to know you're here with me. The garden party was a masterpiece of spring joy. Cherry blossoms swirled in the breeze, pastel silks brushed against the grass, and gentlemen spoke in low, polite tones. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, bathing Thalia's rich caramel-brown skin in a golden glow. But Thalia felt none of the warmth. She stood frozen near the rose bushes, her breath trapped in her throat. The man walking toward her was unmistakable. St. John Waverley, the Ice Duke, a man who possessed a fortune that could rival the crown, yet was whispered about in drawing rooms as a man without a soul, a man who had avoided marriage for a decade. And now he was crossing the lawn with slow, deliberate steps, his gaze locking onto her like a target. Beside Thalia, a rival debutante dropped her fan. "Oh, heavens," she whispered, "he heard you." I was angry, Thalia thought, panic fluttering in her chest. I was only angry. The Duke stopped a few feet from her. Up close, he was terrifyingly handsome, his dark hair stark against the pale petals falling around him. His eyes were unreadable, cool and detached. The garden held its breath. "Miss Ravenshaw," he said. His voice was deep, smooth, and utterly devoid of humor. "Your Grace," she managed, her chin staying high despite her trembling hands. "I heard you," he said simply. Thalia's stomach dropped. "Your Grace, surely you understand." "I heard your vow," he interrupted, his voice cutting through the silence, "and I accept." The words struck her harder than the gossip ever could. "You accept?" she repeated faintly. "I do." And for a fleeting second, something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You require a husband. I require a duchess who asks for nothing but my name. We are agreed." "But it was a jest," someone cried out from the crowd. The Duke turned his head, silencing the onlooker with a single glare. Then he looked back at Thalia. "I am not laughing, Miss Ravenshaw." The silence that followed the Duke's declaration was absolute, heavy with the scent of crushed grass and scandal. Before Thalia could retreat or the onlookers could recover their wits, the Duke of Northmere offered his arm. It was a gesture of command, not courtesy. "Walk with me, Miss Ravenshaw," he said, his voice low enough to slide under the whispers that were just beginning to rise. "Unless you prefer to remain here as the afternoon's entertainment." Thalia stiffened, her pride warring with her mortification. With a lift of her chin that cost her every ounce of courage she possessed, she laid her gloved hand on his forearm. His sleeve was rough wool, but the arm beneath was rigid as iron. He led her away from the gaping crowd toward a secluded archway heavy with cascading white blooms. Once they were shielded from immediate view, he stopped and turned to face her. The shadows of the leaves danced over his sharp features, making his gray eyes seem even more impenetrable. "You meant what you said," he stated, studying her face with a disquieting intensity. "You require a husband to silence them, and I require a wife." "To silence them?" Thalia let out a breathless, incredulous laugh. "Your Grace, I spoke in anger. I did not intend to bind myself to a stranger." "And yet you are bound. By tomorrow, the story of your desperation will be in every parlor in London. You have two choices: retreat in shame, or marry a duke and rule over the very people who mocked you." Thalia looked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was right, but there was a third option her father had already arranged: a marriage to Mr. Langford, a man whose plantation wealth was built on cruelty and whose gaze made her skin crawl. Langford wanted to own her. This man simply wanted to acquire her. "What sort of marriage would this be?" Thalia asked, her voice steadying. "You are known to be solitary." "Practical," the Duke answered without hesitation. "I offer you my title, my protection, and your independence. You will have your own funds and your own life. In return, I require a hostess for Northmere and a duchess who understands the rules." He stepped closer, the air around him seeming to drop in temperature. "I have no room for sentiment, Miss Ravenshaw. I can offer you safety, but I will never offer you love. Do not expect it." Thalia looked up at him. He was beautiful in a devastating, severe way, like a landscape carved from ice. But ice was better than the fire of Langford's cruelty. This was a business arrangement, cold, clean, and safe. "Safety is a luxury I cannot afford to refuse," she whispered. She met his gaze squarely. "You may call on my father tomorrow, Your Grace." He gave a sharp nod, satisfied. Tomorrow, then. As he turned to leave, leaving her alone amidst the falling petals, Thalia shivered. He had secured his duchess with the efficiency of a man buying a horse. But as she watched his retreating figure, a question took root in her mind, sharper than fear. What kind of wound was deep enough to make a man like that board up his heart forever? News in London traveled faster than light, and scandal traveled faster still. By midnight, the tale of Miss Ravenshaw's garden declaration had flown through every ballroom and gambling hell in the city. It was whispered behind fans that Thalia was mad, or desperate, or perhaps, most chillingly, calculating. Thalia did not sleep. She sat by her window, watching the moon trace a slow, indifferent arc across the sky. Every creak of the house sounded like an accusation. When the first gray bleed of dawn stained the horizon, she was still fully dressed, her silk gown crushed and weary, waiting for the reckoning. It came with the morning tea. Her father, Mr. Ravenshaw, paced the small drawing room like a caged tiger, his face flushed with a dangerous mix of humiliation and fear. Her mother sat on the velvet settee, weeping into a lace handkerchief, her sobs the only sound breaking the heavy silence. "Reckless!" her father bellowed, turning on Thalia. "To shout like a fishwife, to gamble your reputation on a whim. Do you have any idea what you have done?" "I saved myself," Thalia said, her voice trembling but her spine straight. "Mr. Langford would have crushed me, Papa. You know he would have." "Langford holds my debts," her father roared, slamming his hand onto the mantelpiece. "He holds this house. Do you think a duke, the Duke of Northmere of all men, will honor a vow made in a garden? He is mocking us, Thalia. He will arrive, laugh in my face, and leave us to Langford's mercy." "He is not mocking us," Thalia insisted, though the cold memory of the Duke's eyes made her doubt her own words.
He gave me his word. He requires a wife who expects nothing. A wife who expects nothing gets exactly that, her mother sobbed, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. He is a statue, Thalia, a cold, unfeeling monument. You will freeze to death in that great stone abbey of his. Better to freeze than to burn in Langford's hell, Thalia shot back. Before her father could retort, the gravel outside crunched under the heavy wheels of a carriage. It was barely past dawn, an hour so early it was practically an insult or a declaration of supreme power. The room went deathly silent. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hall, the door opened, and the butler stood there, looking pale and thoroughly shaken. "Your Grace, the Duke of Northmere," he announced, his voice cracking. St. John Waverley stepped into the room. He seemed to suck the air out of the space, his presence so large and commanding that the cozy drawing room suddenly felt like a dollhouse. He was dressed for riding, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his expression unyielding. He did not look at Thalia, he looked straight at her father. "Mr. Ravenshaw," the Duke said, his voice deep and devoid of morning pleasantries, "I trust you are awake. We have a marriage to discuss, and I have no patience for long engagements." Thalia watched her father's face, the anger drained away, replaced by a stark, terrified calculation. Langford's debts on one side, the Ice Duke on the other. He opened his mouth, and for a terrifying heartbeat, Thalia did not know if he would bow or order the Duke to leave. St. John Waverley did not wait for an invitation to sit, nor did he offer the customary pleasantries regarding the weather or the season. He stood before the hearth, blocking the weak morning light that filtered through the drapes, casting a long shadow over the frayed Persian rug. "I am aware of your financial entanglement with Mr. Langford," the Duke said, his voice level and devoid of judgment. "It is a sordid business, Ravenshaw. I intend to end it." Thalia's father blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "End it? Your Grace, the sum is—" "Inconsequential to me," the Duke cut in. "Upon the signing of the marriage settlements, your debts will be cleared. You will retain this house. In exchange, Miss Ravenshaw becomes the Duchess of Northmere immediately." A gasp escaped Thalia's mother, her hands flying to her mouth. But the Duke was not finished. He turned to Thalia, his gray eyes cooling even further, shifting from a negotiator to a judge. "As for you, Miss Ravenshaw," he said, and the room seemed to shrink until it held only the two of them, "I do not seek a traditional union. I require a duchess to manage my estates and maintain the dignity of my name. In return, I offer you terms most women in England would kill for." He took a step closer, counting the points on his gloved fingers. "You will have your own household funds, independent of my oversight. You will have full authority over the domestic staff and the renovation of the abbey. Your opinions on the management of the tenants will be heard and respected." He paused, his expression hardening. "And regarding our private lives, I will not force my attentions upon you. Your bedchamber will remain your own, barring the necessity of an heir, which we shall discuss only when you are ready. You will have your liberty, madam. I only ask for your loyalty." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. It was a scandalous offer, a marriage stripped of romance but loaded with power. It was a business contract, cold and unyielding, yet it offered Thalia the one thing she had never possessed, agency. "Thalia," her mother whispered, horrified, "you cannot. A marriage without affection—" "Is better than a marriage of cruelty," Thalia finished. She stepped away from the window. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She looked at her father, who was already calculating his salvation, and then at the Duke, who waited with the stillness of a predator who knows he is already won. "I accept," Thalia said clearly. The Duke nodded once, a sharp, precise movement. "Then we are agreed." As he turned to instruct her father on the solicitors, Thalia felt a strange cold weight settle in her chest. She had escaped the fire of Langford's wrath, yes, she had secured her freedom, but as she looked at the broad, unyielding back of her future husband, the terrifying reality of her angry vow crashed down upon her. She had promised to marry the first man through the door, and fate had delivered a king among men, but one who had just promised with absolute certainty that he would never love her.
Speed in Regency England was a luxury reserved for the very wealthy or the very desperate. For the Duke of Northmere, it was simply a matter of command. While ordinary lovers waited 3 weeks for banns to be read in sleepy parish churches, St. John Waverley obtained a special license from the Archbishop's office before the ink on the marriage settlements was dry. The Ravenshaw household dissolved into a chaotic blur of seamstresses and packing crates. Thalia stood in the center of the storm, strangely still, while pins were tucked and hems were rushed. There was no time for a new trousseau. Her best ivory silk, intended for the season's final ball, was ruthlessly altered into a wedding gown. Her mother sat in the corner of the dressing room, her eyes swollen and red. She watched the seamstress adjust the lace at Thalia's throat with a look of profound mourning. "You think you have escaped a monster," Mrs. Ravenshaw whispered, the words trembling in the air. "But you are walking into a winter that never ends, Thalia. Langford would have been cruel, yes, he is a brute, but a cold husband. Silence can wound deeper than a raised hand, my child. Cruelty you can fight against. Indifference will simply rot your soul." Thalia met her own gaze in the looking-glass. The woman staring back was pale, her dark eyes wide with a fear she refused to voice. The ivory silk gleamed against her skin, cool and smooth. She looked less like a bride and more like a sacrifice prepared for a marble altar. My dears, if this moment of trembling courage moves you, please hit subscribe right now, because if you don't, I dread we may never finish telling you how Thalia's story ends. And if you truly cannot subscribe, come confess your reasons in the comments so I may weep with you. The morning of the wedding arrived with a terrifying brilliance. The sun streamed through the window, indifferent to the dread pooling in Thalia's stomach. There would be no grand breakfast, no procession through cheering crowds, just a carriage waiting to take her to the Duke's private chapel. Thalia smoothed the silk over her hips. Her hands shook violently, but she forced them still, pressing them flat against the fabric until the tremor ceased. She had challenged fate in a garden, and fate had answered with a slamming door. Now she had to find the strength to turn the handle. Taking a breath that felt like inhaling glass, she turned away from the mirror and walked toward the unknown. The private chapel at Northmere House was a place of shadows and ancient stone, smelling faintly of beeswax and centuries of silence. It was a stark contrast to the sun-drenched garden where Thalia had sealed her fate, yet as she stepped through the heavy oak doors, she refused to shiver. The air here was still, weighted with the history of a lineage she was about to join, a lineage that had crushed lesser women. She moved down the narrow aisle, the ivory silk of her hasty wedding gown whispering against the flagstones. A simple string of pearls, a last-minute gift from her mother, gleamed softly against the rich caramel-brown warmth of her skin. She held her head high, aware that her parents stood weeping and trembling in the front pew, while the Duke's few witnesses, a pair of somber solicitors and a grim-faced aunt, watched with critical eyes. St. John Waverley waited at the altar. He did not turn as she approached. He stood like a sentinel, dark and immovable.
Only when she reached his side did he look at her, his gray eyes sweeping over her with a gaze that felt less like an inspection and more like an acknowledgement of a formidable opponent. The vicar began the service, his voice thin in the vast space, but the Duke's voice, when it came, was resonant and clear. He did not offer flowery promises of undying affection. Instead, he turned to her, taking her gloved hand in his to speak words that felt less like a prayer and more like a treaty. "I, St. John, take you, Thalia, to be my duchess," he recited, his thumb pressing firmly against her pulse. "I vow to protect your person, to honor your mind, and to respect your liberty. I offer you my name and my shield from this day forward." Thalia's breath caught. Liberty. He had woven their private agreement into the holy rites, speaking of freedom where other men spoke of obedience. She looked up, startled, and felt a shock traverse her arm. Through the kid skin of her glove, his hand was not cold. It was startlingly, unnervingly warm, a living heat beneath the stone facade. "And I," she replied, her voice gaining strength as she anchored herself to that surprising warmth, "take you, St. John, to be my husband. I vow to keep your secrets, to manage your home with honesty, and to stand by your side in truth." The ring, heavy gold, crested and ancient, slid onto her finger. The vicar pronounced them man and wife. There was no kiss, only a stiff bow from the Duke and a curtsy from Thalia that felt more like a parry in a duel than a romantic gesture. They walked back down the aisle together, the heavy doors groaning open to reveal the gray London sky. The world outside had not changed, but everything within Thalia had shifted on its axis. She was a duchess now. They stepped into the velvet-lined interior of the coach, and the footman slammed the door, shutting out the weeping parents and the judgmental world. The carriage lurched forward, the wheels clattering against the cobblestones. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, until the Duke shifted. Thalia dared to glance at the stranger she had just married, waiting for the ice to return. The carriage wheels found a rhythm on the Great North Road, a steady, hypnotic drumming that measured the miles between Thalia's past and her uncertain future. Inside the velvet-lined compartment, the air was thick with the scent of leather and the faint, crisp aroma of the Duke's cologne, something like cedar and rain. For hours, St. John Waverley read correspondence he had pulled from a leather satchel, his concentration absolute. Thalia watched the English countryside blur from the manicured greens of the south into the wilder, grayer moors of the north. Finally, as the light began to bruise purple against the horizon, he set his papers aside. "You have not slept," he observed, his voice startling in the small space, "and you are gripping the window strap as if you expect the carriage to fly off a cliff." Thalia loosened her white-knuckled grip, smoothing her skirts. "I am merely contemplating my duties, Your Grace. A wife's role is usually clearly defined. Yours remains abstract." "There is nothing abstract about it," he said, leaning back. The shadows played across the sharp planes of his face. "I see the question behind your eyes, Thalia. Let me answer it plainly. There is no timeline for an heir. I have lived 30 years without a son. I can wait a while longer. You are not a broodmare, and I am not a man governed by base urges. Your door remains locked until you choose to turn the key." Thalia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The knot of dread in her stomach loosened, replaced by a sudden, daring curiosity. "You speak of urges and heirs with such clinical distance," she ventured, turning to face him fully. "Tell me, St. John, have you ever loved, or is your heart truly as walled off as the gossips claim?" The question hung in the air, audacious and intimate. "Never," he answered. The word was swift, sharp as a blade. "I do not believe I am capable of it. Love is a chaotic, destructive force. I prefer order." Thalia looked at him. really looked at him. Beneath the severe brow and the hard set of his mouth, she saw not cruelty, but a fierce, protective isolation, a man who had built a fortress of ice to keep the world from burning him. A small, wry smile touched her lips. "Then we are well matched, husband, for I have seen what passion did to my parents, and I have no wish to burn." St. John's gaze dropped to her mouth. For a fleeting second, the cool gray of his eyes darkened, a crack appearing in the ice. He looked as though he wanted to ask her something, or perhaps warn her, but the moment shattered as the carriage slowed. "We have arrived," he announced, his voice reverting to its usual steel. Talia turned to the window. Looming out of the twilight was Northmere Abbey, a sprawling Gothic beast of stone and turret etched against a darkening sky. It was magnificent, ancient, and imposing. As the carriage passed through the massive gates and they clanged shut behind them with a final resonant boom, Talia thought a chill that had nothing to do with the northern wind. She had asked for safety. She had asked for a wall between her and the world, but as the abbey swallowed the carriage's shadow, she wondered if she had entered a sanctuary or if she was now the sole prisoner of the most lonely place on earth. The transition from the wind-scoured moors to the interior of Northmere Abbey was jarring, though not in the way Talia had feared. She had braced herself for a mausoleum, cold stone and colder silences. Instead, as the footman threw open the heavy oak doors, she was met with a flood of warmth. A fire roared in the great hearth, and a line of servants stood waiting, not with the trembling fear she associated with her father's household, but with genuine, welcoming smiles. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, curtsied low, her eyes crinkling with a kindness that instantly thawed a fraction of the ice around Talia's heart. "Welcome home, Your Grace," she said, and for the first time the title did not feel like a burden. Dinner was served in a private dining room, a space intimate enough that the silence could not stretch too thin. Thalia picked at her pheasant, waiting for the inevitable interrogation or the dismissal she was used to from men of rank. Instead, the Duke poured her wine himself, ignoring the hovering footman, and asked, "How do you intend to fill your days here, Thalia? The north is quiet, but not without its muses." Surprised, Thalia found herself answering. She spoke of the books she had been denied by a father who found reading unbecoming, and of the music she missed. Then, hesitantly, she spoke of her paints, packed away in the bottom of her trunk for fear they were too messy for a lady of quality. She watched him as she spoke, expecting the glazed look of boredom she had seen on so many suitors' faces in London. St. John did not look away. He watched her hands as they animated her words, his expression intense and focused, absorbing every syllable. When she fell silent, fearing she had said too much, he turned to the butler standing in the shadows. "Open the north gallery tomorrow," he commanded quietly. "It faces the morning sun and has the best light in the county. Have the easels brought down from the attic and ensure Her Grace has whatever oils she requires sent up from York." Thalia stared at him, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "You would give me the gallery? For my own use?" "I promised you liberty," he said, his voice dropping an octave, the vibration of it traveling through the mahogany table. "And a duchess should not hide her talents in a crate. And here, my dears, if this fragile beginning touches your heart, subscribe now before the fear creeps in that these stories might fade away. If you cannot bring yourself to subscribe, please come to the comments and tell me why, so I may understand and perhaps change your mind." Later, as Thalia stood in her bedchamber, a room of pale blues and soft velvet that overlooked the moonlit gardens, she looked at the heavy brass key in the door. She had expected a prison. She had found a sanctuary where her voice was not only heard, but honored. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the key, but she did not turn it. And though love has not yet stirred in these ancient, echoing halls, something far more dangerous has begun to take root: the terrifying possibility that two souls sworn to protect themselves from the world might one day lower their shields and choose each other.